It's pretty common to see clinicians with a public following, especially mental health professionals, typically add disclaimers to their content. Today, the reasoning for this seems pretty straightforward, what with the possibility of worsening stigma and incurring liability. However, in the US at least, that wasn't always the case. As history would have it, it'd take a presidential election back in 1964 to actually change things. Let's dive into this, shall we? Our video begins with this guy, Barry Goldwater. Born in Arizona in 1909, he dropped out of college to begin his career and join his family business. More specifically, he was taking over his father's department store after his father had fallen ill. Goldwater eventually pivoted into politics, getting elected to the Phoenix City Council in 1949 and then the U.S. Senate in 1952. By 1955, he was the chair of the Republican Campaign Committee, and by 1958, having won re-election to his Senate seat, he'd firmly settled himself into the role of an Arizona senator. Goldwater was definitely conservative by the standards of his time. For example, he was super anti-communist, pushing for harsher stances against the then Soviet Union. He was also against government support programs, such as Medicaid or Medicare. In fact, Arizona didn't join the Medicaid system until 1982. His first book was titled The Conscience of a Conservative, and he accused Democrats of creating a quasi-socialist system in the US. You get the picture. To say the 1960s was a tumultuous time in the United States would be an understatement, and this was pretty clearly reflected in the politics of the time. It was against this backdrop, in January of 1964, that Goldwater announced he'd be running for president. By June, he won the Republican nomination and became the candidate who would go on to face then-President Lyndon B. Johnson, the former vice president to John F. Kennedy, who'd been assassinated the year before. However, not everyone in the Republican Party was happy with Goldwater as their presidential representative. Some people considered his views, especially his proposed foreign policies, to be dangerously extreme. For example, during his presidential campaign, he made clear that he was willing to break diplomatic relations and renege on a nuclear pact made with the Soviet Union unless certain conditions were met, and he wouldn't rule out using nuclear weapons in Vietnam. Ads against Barry Goldwater capitalized on these fears. In one example, called the Daisy ad, a young girl innocently counts the petals off of flowers that she picks, matching a countdown to a nuclear bomb. Yikes. Goldwater also voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964, citing that he believed certain sections of the then bill gave the government too much overreach. Even bigger yikes. Was that really the thing you should have been focusing on? Long story short, many of his political views weren't exactly helping his numbers, and in many cases, even alienated voters. Voting demographic shifts weren't the only thing to come out of Goldwater's 1964 presidential bid. During the campaign run, the editors of a small magazine, somewhat ironically called Fact magazine, ran a survey where they asked 12,356 psychiatrists, "Do you believe Barry Goldwater is psychologically fit to serve as president of the United States?" Perhaps not surprisingly, the vast majority of psychiatrists didn't care to respond. However, Fact did have some takers, 2,417 to be exact. Of those, 651 did think Goldwater was psychologically fit enough. 571 said they didn't know enough to have an informed opinion either way. That's the right answer, by the way. And a whopping 1,189 psychiatrists said no. And the no's? They were wild. Some psychiatrists wrote in comparing Goldwater to totalitarian leaders, like Hitler and Stalin. Others asserted that he must be suffering from some kind of psychosis or schizophrenia. And still others hurled out straight-up insults and hateful comments that were thinly, and I mean very thinly, veiled as clinical opinions. Goldwater ended up losing his bid for president by a landslide. He only won in 6 states, 5 in the Deep South, and in his own home state of Arizona. This was in no small part due to factors like his unpopular ideas, and the public concern, if not outright disdain, justified outright disdain, that they sparked. It also didn't help that at the time, the US was enjoying a time of relative economic prosperity, and Johnson had been seen as a stabilizing force in the aftermath of the JFK assassination. Goldwater would eventually be re-elected as a senator of Arizona, where he would spend the remainder of his career. As it turns out, the survey that Fact magazine would hail as the most intensive character analysis ever made of a living being was also the end of Fact magazine. Goldwater sued them for libel. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and Fact was forced to settle for $75,000. a sum that would eventually bankrupt the publication. In the aftermath of the 1964 election, the American Psychiatric Association was forced to take a look in the mirror. The circus of opinions sparked by the survey illustrated that psychiatrists weren't immune from using their professional credentials to back unprofessional actions. After all, it's likely that as the organization for psychiatrists in the United States, many of the survey responses could have come from its own members. We'll never know for sure, though, because most of the answers were returned anonymously. I mean, I guess they had that much sense. The APA's response was a statement in section 7.3 of the... Ooh, that's a long name. Hold on, let's see if I can do this in one breath. Principles of Medical Ethics with annotations especially applicable to psychiatry. Ultimately finalized in 1973. The statement reads, "It is unethical for a psychiatrist to offer a professional opinion unless he or she has conducted an examination and has been granted proper authorization for such a statement." So basically, unless you've examined them in person and you have the proper permission to share their diagnosis, keep those opinions to yourself. Since its release, the rule has been widely and readily adapted, and not just by members of the American Psychiatric Association, but also by other mental health professionals, even though that statement is nowhere near as binding in those fields. And while debates on the Goldwater rule persist today, for example, questions about how this squares with freedom of speech, or if and when mental health professionals' duty to warn may supersede the rule, or what exactly counts as a professional opinion, the vast majority agree that it's for the best that at least some version of this rule is here to stay. That's all for now. If you're interested in deep dives like this, or some of the topics covered in this video, then please check out my channel and subscribe for future content. Thanks so much for watching.